So it's always a challenge to preach a Bible text as well known as Psalm 23. It's not so much that familiarity breeds contempt as much as we've been there, done that, heard that. You know, we hear these words from Psalm 23, and we find comfort in them. For instance, we often hear this text read at most memorial services and funerals. But sometimes they just kind of go in one ear and out the other. It's kind of like when we say the Lord's Prayer. We know the words, but we don't really pay attention to them. Now, Psalm 23 is often one of those Bible passages we ask our children to memorize, or going through confirmation class, they're asked to memorize. And again, sometimes these passages, this beautiful poem that is Psalm 23, sometimes we don't really, again, pay attention to what those words say. And that's unfortunate, because I think in a most profound way, Psalm 23 has something to say to us as we live in the midst of COVID-19. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Now, the truth be known, a shepherd is actually kind of an archaic metaphor, is it not? We who live in a modern life, in a modern world, in modern times, I can honestly say I don't think, at least not to my knowledge, that I have ever met a shepherd. And if I've encountered sheep, it's usually at a petting zoo, and they're rather smelly, and I don't really like to pet them. Yet even so, this symbol carries a sense of meaning, a connotation of loving care and guidance. The shepherd is this image of protection and care. The image of a shepherd can have significant meaning for us. A shepherd who leads us, as the poem says, to green pastures to feed and to still waters to drink. It's a beautiful, meaningful metaphor for who God is to us and for us Christians. Jesus, who said, I am the shepherd, the good shepherd. So it is still a meaningful metaphor, even if we don't know any shepherds or have any shepherds who live next door. I am the shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. Now, the passage has in Psalm 23, yea, though I walk through the darkest valley. Now, most of us remember an older translation, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Now, part of the reason that was translated that way is the Hebrew word for darkness here is also the same root word for death and has connotations of a shadow and of darkness. So the idea is not necessarily the darkest valley is death, but the idea is to express something larger, that we all in life walk through darkest valleys. And I don't know about you, but it feels like we are walking through the darkest of valleys right now. There's a sense of us not being able to see where we are going. We cannot even really make decisions about where we are going as we struggle to know what is the right thing to do and what can we do to protect and save ourselves. We don't really know or anticipate, or can we anticipate what lies ahead other than some kind of new normal. Church leaders, community leaders struggle with questions of what can we do when we don't know what's going to happen. If anything, we are at this moment walking through the darkest valley. When do we gather in person again? What will worship look like? What will church fellowship be like? Those are questions as we blindly stumble through the darkness, unsure of what's happening or where we'll be going. Now, I don't know about you, but when I am stressed and anxious, more often than not, I have kind of what human beings, all of us have, a fight and flight response. Now, the way I fight is I get busy. I kind of operate on the premise, the Lord is coming, so look busy. And so the way I fight is I try to control things. I try to plan for every possibility and develop tactics. And I drive myself crazy, busyness, trying to get prepared for what's impossible to prepare for. So I fight myself and find myself anxious and stressed. And then there's the flight response. I'll run away as fast as I can into my head. Really just withdraw because we're so afraid and so anxious about what the future will bring or what's going to happen in the future. So we are all of us walking through this dark valley, afraid and anxious and uncertain. But the promise, I think the most meaningful part of this passage is that, yea, though I walk through the darkest valley, you are with me. And again, the tactic isn't fight or flight. The tactic, or what we do, is we walk through the valley. Barb Gaddis reminded us of that a number of weeks ago in the sermon conversation. We don't avoid the darkness. God never promised we wouldn't have those moments. We don't not experience the valley. What we do is we walk through the darkness and the uncertainty, trusting in the shepherd, whose rod and staff comfort us, whose presence guide us through. We may be stumbling along in the dark, but we're not. We are not stumbling alone. God is there. God supports us. God cares for us. With this promise, no matter as we walk through this darkest valley, goodness and mercy will follow us. Now, Richard Rohr is a Benedictine monk, also an author, who puts out a daily devotional from his Center for Contemplation and Action. Beautiful devotionals reflecting on the spiritual life. And just this past week, he's been reflecting on a thing called liminal space. And the idea is, liminal comes from a Latin word which means threshold. And his idea is that we especially, the dark valley we're experiencing right now, we might say, is this threshold. That we're in this space where the old has passed away. And we don't know what the new will look like. This threshold we find ourselves, and it makes us anxious because we're passing in and on to something we cannot imagine or know for sure what it looks like. All we know is what we knew before will no longer be past this threshold. And that disorients us, that makes us scared. But Rohr reminds us that God especially is at that threshold, guiding us, leading us, protecting us, even comforting us. And even though I miss what was the old, I'm kind of interested to see as we walk through this darkest valley what God has in store beyond that. As individuals, as churches, as communities. Maybe as a church, beyond that threshold, beyond that darkest valley, Jesus is leading us, God is guiding us, the shepherd is protecting us. We might have a church which knows worship isn't simply something that happens in a building, but is out there in our homes and in the world. Beyond that threshold, beyond the darkest valley, a church that realizes how profoundly we are connected to each other, how important and vital that is to who we are. And beyond that threshold, as we walk through the darkest valley, is it possible we will have a church more in tune with, more understanding of the vulnerability of those around us, of the poor, of the food insecure, and maybe a more profound connection to that community, a deeper desire to reach out and care for the least of these. We are on the threshold of something new, and it's scary. We're not quite sure what it looks like, but the promise in Psalm 23 is the Lord is with us, and it will lead to something incredibly profound. Now, I began with the Psalm 23. I began with the poem that is the Psalm 23. And I want to share a poem written that was shared with me these past few weeks by a church member. It was written by our first youth poet laureate, a woman, an African-American woman named Amanda Gorman. She wrote this beautiful poem in the midst of COVID-19 and coronavirus, and I think it captures this essence of Psalm 23. Words I think we need to hear and be reminded of, and the title of this poem is The Miracle of Mourning. So I'm going to read a few selections from it. I thought I'd awaken to a world in mourning, heavy clouds crowding, a society storming, but there's something different on this golden morning, something magical in the sunlight, wide and warming. While we might feel small, separate, and all alone, our people have never been more closely tethered. The question isn't if we will weather this unknown, but how will we weather this unknown together? So on this meaningful morn, we mourn and we mend like light. We can't be broken, even when we bend. As one, we will defeat both despair and disease. We ignite not in the light, but in the lack thereof. For it is in loss that we truly learn to love. In this chaos, we will discover clarity. In suffering, we must find solidarity. For it's our grief that gives us our gratitude, shows us how to find hope if we ever lose it. So ensure that this ache wasn't endured in vain. Do not ignore the pain, give it purpose, use it. And we'll observe how the burdens braved by humankind are also the moments that make humans kind. And let every dawn find us courageous, brought closer, heeding the light before the fight is over. And when this ends, we'll smile sweetly, finally seeing in testing times we become the best of beings. Alleluia. The Lord is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia.